afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us here at the New Smyrna Museum of History for this round of Archaeology Works. And we're actually joined today by Emma Dietrich with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. Emma actually earned her BA in anthropology from Mercyhurst University and actually just finished defending her master's studies degree in historical archaeology through the University of West Florida. Her thesis research focuses on curricula development for the Milton High School Archaeology Project. And before moving to the Florida's East Central region, Emma worked as a graduate assistant with the Northwest region and interned with the Midwest Archaeological Center and the Heritage Education Network. Her interests include public education and outreach, historical archaeology, and climate science. And please join me in clapping wildly from your homes, Emma Dietrich.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. I think it's super ironic that as soon as I got introduced, my phone started to ring, and I know it's just someone to call to make sure if I voted or not, or about my extended car warranty. So I'm Emma Dietrich. I'll get started with a screen share. So we're going to share. And hopefully everyone can see what I'm looking at here, and we'll get started talking about beads. So first off, I just want to talk a little bit about the features of GoToMeeting. In the top right-hand corner, there is a chat button that you can click on and ask questions. I'll get to those at the end. And at the same time, if you do not know how to mute or turn your camera on, those are at the bottom, and they're those green lights. And without further ado, we'll get started. So first off, I always like to ask, why am I here talking to you? So I'm an archaeologist who works for the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and I am based in the East Central region, which is about 45 minutes from New Smyrna, and I am partnered up with the Northeast office. So we have 8 regional centers throughout the entire state of Florida, so you can find an FPAN person no matter where you're living. And our jobs are kind of to do 3 main things: to assist local governments in any sort of archaeological work or concerns that they have, assist the state's Division of Historical Resources, and to do education outreach and promote Florida's buried and submerged past. So we'll get started on our beads conversation. So our first big question is, where do we find beads? So within archaeological sites, beads are a prominent feature, and they date back all the way to our Paleo-Indian period, which I'm going to move my screen here. So they date all the way back to the Paleo-Indian period, and archaeologists have found tiny, tiny seed beads made out of stone in spring sites around Apalachee Bay in Florida. And Paleo-Indian sites can date all the way back to 14,000 years ago within the state of Florida. So we also find our bead sites at our pre-contact sites. So these are sites that are Native American sites that do not have European contact just yet. So some of the sites we find beads at are at Windover, which is a 9,000 or archaic period burial site in Brevard County. And in those burials, we found a large collection of shell beads, catfish vertebra beads, sable palmetto seed beads, so the actual seeds from the palmettos were turned into beads, and along with shells, and they were interred with a 21-year-old individual. We also found beads of shells associated with children burials, including antler beads, so beads made out of deer antler. In Mill Cove Complex, which is in Duval County, it's an early Mississippian period, and this has produced a number of beads, including this really cool shark's tooth pendant that shows had a small drill through and has become a bead. We also find beads at sites that are right at that contact period, right when DeSoto is coming in contact with our Native Americans that are living in Florida. And Tatham Mound is a burial mound in Citrus County. And this burial mound site has both evidence of contact with Europeans, or more specifically, contact with the Spanish, and its pre-contact to more traditional beads. These beads include stereotypical, which I'll get into, Spanish-made beads, including our very famous Nueva Cadiz and chevron beads. And these are tied most likely directly to DeSoto. We also find beads that are just in European contexts. So Europeans bring glass beads with them to the New World, some for personal use, but primarily for trade with the Native Americans. Some of the earliest trade beads that are found are from 1565 Menendez encampment, which is located at the Fountain of Youth, just north of St. Augustine. But we also have beads that date to 1559, which I'm coming out of the University of West Florida, so I tend to talk about the Luna settlement just a little bit. But in the Luna settlement, they were able to identify the site based on the presence of beads, which allowed them to date the site to 1559, the presence of those Nueva Cadiz beads. We also find beads at Seminole War period sites. So these beads were from the Nelson's Grove in Pasco County. And what's ironic enough is that during the Seminole Wars, the United States military were actually bringing along with them trade beads to facilitate trade with the Seminole. So we find beads in those contexts as well. We find beads continuing up into plantation periods, and archaeologists find beads at the site in Kingsley Plantation. These beads specifically were found on the floor of one of the tabby cabins of the enslaved individuals. They found the blue beads along with some amber glass beads, iron objects, and uniquely enough, a chicken burial. And trade beads throughout all enslaved archaeological sites, they primarily are blue glass trade beads, which has led to some archaeologists to hypothesize that the blue trade beads have a traditional or a cultural belief system tied to them that relates directly back to African cultures. Although there's a few theories about that and there's a few understandings, it's not widely accepted just yet. So again, these are in Kingsley Plantation, just outside of Jacksonville, which is an amazing site if anyone gets to go. We also find beads from our colonial period from the Jimenez Fatio site in downtown St. Augustine, and we find these really all over. And these beads are the raspberry beads, and they're named such because they have little tiny little, almost look like little raspberries. They're indented and molded, and they date to the 1700s to the 1800s. So just like how we find beads, we kind of understand how beads were used, and beads have multiple different purposes. One of the major first aspects of bead use is religious purposes. A lot of beads are found from rosaries, such as these jet beads that were uncovered, and jet is a mineral, like a type of stone, and they were heavily used with making rosary beads at the time. We also find beads for the more kind of traditional use, which is just jewelry and adornment. This earring was found in downtown St. Augustine, and it includes small glass trade beads or small glass seed beads that are placed onto a wire and formed into an earring, which is pretty cool to find the earring. Beads are also used to facilitate trade. So a lot of times people refer to these beads as trade beads, and that is because the Europeans brought them with the sole purpose of trading for goods. Those goods include everything from food to services to furs to information, and even down to peace treaties and settlements. Glass trade beads were a form of currency in the New World. Beads are also used for grave goods, where individuals are interred with large amounts of beads, both as necklaces or just loose. So many beads in Native American contexts are found in burials. This is both before and after contact. In fact, some of the mission sites, only Native people are found buried with grave goods such as these beads. There's a site in St. Catherine's Island, which that's where this picture is from, that these burials are associated with thousands and thousands of beads, and each of the individuals are interred with large amounts of glass trade beads. And I'll talk a little bit about that site later on. So what do beads teach an archaeologist, or how do we learn about beads? Why are they even important? In an archaeological context, beads tell us a lot about global trade routes. Glass manufacturing did not become a large thing in the New World until the 19th century. So glass beads are primarily being made in Italy, Germany, France, and even Spain, and they're being shipped all over the world. So we can get insight into global trade networks, can understand where certain beads are going and where certain individuals are going to take the beads with them. Sites throughout the United States with 16th century trade beads, you can kind of see that we can make the assumption that they're definitely associated with the Spanish coming over, which makes sense. So archaeological sites that contain these beads are primarily in the southeast, a little bit in the southwest, and a few outliers that are up north. We can also learn, which is one of my favorite things about beads, is we can learn about their elemental composition. So colors of glass beads are extremely important, not just to the owners who chose to have a certain color of beads, but also to the archaeologist. So this little machine that you're seeing is a XRF gun, which is the coolest piece of tech archaeologists can use. But what it is, it shoots a laser at an object and it's able to send back the elemental composition or the mineral content. So what the exact breakdown of these glass beads are, or really anything is. So in St. Catherine's Island, which is a site I kind of briefly mentioned with those thousands of glass beads in burial context, these beads were XRF'd and were able to determine where these beads originated from and get back to when the beads were made and the place of manufacture. So we're able to trace where beads are coming in from, which is really unique to note when they were excavating these sites. Different burials in different areas had a different amount of bead, or had beads with a differing elemental analysis. So an individual was buried with beads primarily from one elemental section of beads, while others were interred probably at a later date. So people are coming in with different beads, or were from different trade periods. So the beads that were coming in differed from their elemental composition and differed in time. Another cool archaeological sites that kind of show use of beads is their traditional uses. So this is the African American burial ground in New York City, covered during a development project where they took down a skyscraper, and lo and behold, there's a historic African American burial ground underneath the city. And one of these cases shows a woman who was interred with 112 glass beads around her waist, which is a traditional African wearing pattern where they would wear beads draped around their waist and hips. So that shows the retention of African culture, even in the burial sites in the in New York City. So archaeologists get all this information, but really, how do we study these objects? And really, we study them through their materials, how they're made, their shape, their size, how they're finished, basically everything that you can get out of a small little bead as an individual bead, and is how we study them. So we first study what these beads are made out of. Are they made out of stone? Are they made out of shell or bone? Are they made out of glass? Are they made out of clay? Are they made out of natural stones like the jet rosary beads? Or are they made out of cut crystal? These are all objects that we take in consideration on how these beads were made. So we are going to show a small video next. There is no sound, so I'll try to talk over it. But the Corning Glass Museum in New York is an amazing museum of literally just glass works in the history of glass. And they produced a video on how beads are made. So we'll get this going, hopefully, if everyone can see that. So glass beads are made in a plethora of different materials or different methods, and I'll talk about them a little bit more, but it's always interesting to see how these beads are really made, to kind of talk about the artistry, just because it takes a lot of skill and technique. So wound beads are handmade and not in like a bulk setting. They're individually wound around a mandrel wire, which is just a metal rod that's coated to allow the beads to stick. And it's just a slow application of glass over time and with continued heating. And these can be shaped, molded, faceted, really any sort of techniques. But again, it's always cool to watch a glass artisan work, just because it's phenomenal to see the amount of detail that you're working with molten glass to produce a single bead. And so if people know about the glass needs to be superheated to around, I think it's close to 650 degrees to be able to get to its molten state, or higher. I feel like it might be higher. And traditional methods of getting this just include having to keep air through a large fire to keep that flame extremely hot. Colors and seed beads, which is unique about adding colors to beads or colors to glass in general, are just actually crushed up bits of other colored glass that they've created. So that's how you get these multiple swirly different colors, is actually just from bulk scrap glass. The drawn method is literally creating these long hair-like bits of glass by pooling glass tubes and making them this smaller and smaller. It honestly, I know it sounds weird, but it reminds me a little bit of how you make pool taffy as a kid. You keep pulling that strand slower and slower, and then these drawn rods, these glass rods, are then cut. And depending on how they get cut is the size of the bead. And then they're smoothed out, because obviously no one really wants to have sharp cut glasses or sharp cut or pieces of glass that can end up cutting you. The chevron beads are pretty important for archaeologists, just because they are pretty common for Spanish sites, and how they're made is by layering these multiple different colors of glass and then molding that layer and then next layer to create these really intricate patterns when the bead is finished. And that is a very large bead. So molded beads we tend to see coming into more popularity in the 17th century, and it just makes life a little bit easier, I guess. By molding the beads, you're able to still mass produce and have a little bit more uniformity. You can also kind of crimp these beads as well. So like using a hand press, I will show some more pictures of that in a little bit. Oh, looks like it paused on me. Oh, there we go. Sorry, folks. All right, I think everyone gets the gist of it. If you guys want to watch a little bit more, we can watch this at the end, or we can send a link out to you afterwards, because it is on YouTube and readily available. But we'll get a little bit further into, I guess, me talking and things moving, just because everyone wants to listen to me talk. So that drawn glass method, just to break it down a little bit more without the machine capabilities. So early beads, when they're created using the drawn method, a small air bubble is blown into the glass. Somebody with another pontil rod, or the rod that attaches to the glass, walks away and pulls this long tube of glass, and then they're able to set it and get it dried and cured, and then they go through and cut the beads. To make the chevron beads that we kind of briefly talked about, we saw the video of them making it, but how they do is historically is by crimping the molten glass and then dipping into another section of molten glass and keeping that process of crimping, adding another layer of color, crimping, adding another layer of color to create that intricate zigzaggy design in its cross section. And then these drawn beads are then cut either by a machine to make things nice and easy and uniform, or by hand. If anyone has ever watched the candy making videos, it's the same method where they just kind of cut off these glass rods in various segments, and then they are polished either by reheating or are tumbled to just get rid of the broken or the sharp bits at the end. Wound glass is one of my favorites, just because it takes that process of using that liquid glass and winding it around a rod, as we saw. And what's unique about these is they're individually made by hand, but they also you can see how long it takes to wind. Or these earlier beads, you can see that one long coil of the glass still existing. And then you have molded glass, where it can be molded in a way where glass is poured in, or crushed glass, but a lot of these are taking the hot glass and are crimping the design pattern to create molded beads. And one of the last types of beads for handmade glass beads we see are blown glass beads. Pardon, excuse me. These glass beads are hand blown and then are punctured to create the actual small hole. These are extremely delicate and are really rare to find on archaeological sites, just because they shatter. They kind of just remind me of like old Christmas ornaments, how thin that they are. So how do we end up determining these manufacturing methods? Within archaeology, identifying your artifact is the key thing for archaeologists. You need to be able to figure out as much as you can about your artifact to be able to understand your time periods or the cultures associated. So in determining manufacturer, most beads we find are the drawn and the wound methods. And so when looking at beads, the drawn tend to be a little bit more tubular. They're more uniform in shape, and the bubbles that are in the glass go along the bead instead of going perpendicular. With wound beads, like I kind of said earlier, why they're my favorite is you can see where the glass blower wound it around the mandrel wire, or they're a little bit globbly, little bit ununiform, just look a little bit more varied. They're not as identical as other cases. So beads are broken down into a whole different mess of structure and classification, and I'll show you guys some charts in a little bit. But your key types of beads, you have your simple and compound. Simple being just a single layer of undecorated glass. Kind of imagine your seed beads. They're just a solid color, they're pretty, they're simple. Then you have your compound beads, which are still undecorated but multiple layers. So those chevron beads, where it's different layers of glass molded through. Then that breaks down. You can either have simple or compound bead. Then you get into your complex and composite, which these are specimens that have decorations added to them. So one color with your decoration is your complex. Multiple layered colored glass beads are your composite or your compound beads, but decorations are considered composites. So the methodology behind making the beads classifies it, but also the shape, color, decoration, how beads react to light are all taken into consideration. So it's really kind of fun to know opaque beads are just how the beads react to light. And when identifying beads, the ossifier, or what is used to make the beads more opaque, changes throughout time, specifically in white beads. And those methods are documented, so it provides a way to attempt to date a site based on when these different elements were added to the beads to change its color consistency. We also classify the beads by their modifications based on whether or not they have the decorations, if they are molded, if they have been cut and faceted. All these modifications to beads help us still classify these beads even further down. So the identification method is kind of crazy, but archaeologists are very much people who like to sort and categorize objects. And this is really important for archaeologists to be able to compare on a larger scale. So the beads on our right side of the screen, which is outlined in orange, they are our simple beads. They're one single color. The beads that are then separated on the top are drawn glass beads that have then been tumbled to a rounder shape. On the left-hand side in the green, those are our composite beads, which again, on the top, they've been tumbled down, but you can also see different layers of decoration throughout. And each one of these bead types is given a number or a type or a class of bead, and then we can compare them on all different levels. So again, why all these levels? Or labels. So creating all of these different labels allows us to communicate better across the field. We can compare beads that are found in St. Augustine to beads that are found in the Southwest, into Mexico and South America. We can compare them back to beads found all over the world as a way to, again, understand the better global context and those global trade routes. Similar methods in studying beads helps control the research methodology. So we tend to get at least the same results or same understanding, and leads to a broader understanding of beads in general. And this also creates a gigantic database, because when making objects by hand, things tend to differ. So not every Nueva Cadiz bead or chevron bead has been manufactured exactly the same. They are very easy to identify, but there's all small little variations that we can see throughout all these sites in this great big database of beads. So we also want to understand sourcing of beads. We talked about being a global network, but those or global trade routes to understand how people are interacting. We can also get information about when beads were made. So if we can trace beads back through ship ledgers or what ships were carrying to the New World, we can see if beads were brought in from Italy. We know that Italy, their glassmaking is still phenomenal, is still world renowned, and began as early as the 15th century, and it's still one of the best known locations for their beads. We also have Bohemia, which is known primarily for those molded, intricate beads. Netherlands starts up in the 17th century, and that's because a gentleman in Venice leaves, and he was well known for his drawn beads, and he took that methodology to the Netherlands when he moved. In Spain, or at least not him himself, but his style of bead. In Spain, we don't know much about bead making. We know that beads were being made, and especially because they were made in gilded or wrapped in gold since the 14th century. But what we're thinking is the historical record, when the Spanish were coming over to trade with the New World, the ship's ledgers were listing, you know, Venice beads, or these specific types of beads coming out of the Netherlands, out of Venice, out of Murano. But there are also beads that were just known as beads. And it might be that these just singular beads are actually from Spain, which is why you wouldn't label them as an international good. So then why is it super difficult to date these beads? Dating beads can provide us a good context, but not a specific date. That's just because beads have been around for centuries with very little change. You can walk down the aisle at, Michael's or Joann's, and you can still find a slew of beads that are still kind of looking like the beads that we find on archaeological sites. There are so many different types of beads that exist, especially with just their own unique style or artistry down to like the individual level. And we just don't have a lot of information about manufacturing in general. Trying to find records of early bead manufacturing locations or what they were using, it's a little bit hard to figure things out to get a definitive date on beads. And that's kind of my end of my slew on beads. I can certainly go back to any slides and talk a little bit more if there are questions. I do see there's somebody in the chat. So I think you guys will learn a little bit about this in the next talk about glass, but what do people add to make the color? Is that different minerals or metals? And yes, D, all of the above. When adding different colors to glass, glass originally doesn't want to pool clear, like how we imagine our clear glass today. It took quite a while to get that. Glass is made through the process of burning sand and silica to create the glass, to create this molten, basically silica, and depending on what you burn with it, it changes the color. So a lot of beads include kelp or seaweed burn, which can produce a green color. Wood ash produces a brownish color. Cobalt blue, they literally added in cobalt into the colors to create those blues. Opaque glass, like white glass trade beads, they use tin to ossify to make it a little bit more of a milky consistency. So there's so many different materials that people add in to glass to make them the different colors. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen just at the moment unless anyone has any questions that they want me to go back to. But yeah, does anyone have any questions they want to ask? Feel free to unmute your line or show your face, or has any comments or stories.
Was there a particular color at a particular time or from a particular country?
No, so colors varied quite a bit between different countries and different time periods. It's really popularity that we see when people choose colors. Like blue glass beads are very prominent on enslaved components of plantation sites, and that's just either a color preference or something, but I think it comes down to almost 70% of beads uncovered from enslaved sites. They're primarily like 70% blue, and then with a mixture of amber beads in there as well. I think it just depends on what's readily available. And I also just throwing out there, a lot of people just like the color blue. So I think people make a lot more blue glass trade beads because they're a little bit prettier. Personal opinion, not necessarily true. Any other questions or comments?
It looks like someone put in the chat box, where is the large database of beads stored and can the public access it?
Oh, there's a lot of like online resources to get to information about beads, which since I'm actually in front of a computer, surprise, I can send in a link, one of my favorite resources for beads, and it is just the Parks Canada produced a series on beads, and you can click through it and see so much more about the colors, the classification guides, all of this information. Most of the time, these databases that are out there are from publications, and there's even a I don't know the term, but it's like the Association of Bead Studies, and it's literally an archaeological journal you can subscribe to that's just about beads. And it's just every article is something new. But the Parks Canada series has a really great listing of resources and materials, and so I just sent that link. Oh, Greg, you're muted.
That link is actually in the chat box, and I believe that you had also shared that link. We sent out a reminder video or a reminder email yesterday that had a link to this site. So if you all check that email that you got from us here at the museum yesterday, there's a paper bead making activity included in there, a polymer clay bead making activity. This Parks Canada site is there. I believe it says full text of the Kid and Kid bead classification article and system, and then a blog on beads that was made available through the Florida Public Archaeology Network.
Yeah, and I'll quick also in the link. Here's the YouTube video if anyone want to watch the rest of the bead video. Got a little glitchy towards the end. So that's in the chat link. And I will also just stress, if anyone's super interested in glass works in general, the Corning Museum of Glass, it's a place I used to go to all the time as a kid, is phenomenal, and they have a lot of great online resources as well, just to see how glass is made and produced and how these beads are made. Even to this day, people still hand make amazing beads.